Hello, this is the lecture material for Chapter 2 in Access, the Access textbook. This one's entitled Relational Databases and Queries. I'm going to break this chapter up into 3 videos. So the first part will basically be up through slide 32. And I'll have a video about relationships between tables. And then finally, the third video will be about queries. So we'll get started here. I'm going to start these slides. And let's talk a little bit about relational databases here to start. Here's the objectives for the chapter. We'll need to go through those. We're going to cover them. This first part focuses on table design and how to do it in Access and whatnot. So we'll get into that in this particular video. There's some guidelines. Now remember, a table is the key object in Access. It's where the data resides. So that's why we're starting to talk about that at this point. Also remember that a table is made up of columns or fields. Same thing. Those terms mean the same thing. Columns, fields. And then once you determine which fields are going to make up your table, then when you start adding data to the table, you're basically typing in a record or a row of data into that table. So that's why we say a table is made up of columns and rows. So first of all, we need to focus on the columns or the fields. This slide talks about some guidelines. Now we're going to get a lot more into table design in the second part of this course when we switch to the other textbooks. While we're in this textbook, we're basically going to be using tables and databases that are already in existence. But just cover a few of the guidelines. Of course, you want to include the necessary data that you want to store about a customer or whatever entity you're trying to store data about. You want to design for what you need now, and then if possible, look, and if there's going to be any future changes, maybe incorporate them as soon as possible. It's just easier to do it earlier, the better. Store data in its smallest parts. We'll talk more about that. I think each of these points here have a separate slide, so let me just go to that. Okay, what data is necessary? Sometimes you don't really know. If you're new to databases, you know, okay, what data am I actually going to store? So it's useful if you could get some kind of report or some kind of input form that has the data on it that you're talking about storing, and then use that as a guide to which pieces of data or fields that you may need in your tables. I talked about this a little bit already, so design for now and in the future if you can. Okay, here's the store data in smallest possible pieces. All they're really talking about here is creating, it says create a field name and try to have a field name that's very descriptive of the data that you're going to store, then divide it into smallest pieces. For instance, here's a good example. You're going to store your customer's name. Don't just have a field called name. You will want to break that apart into first name, last name, possibly an initial or a prefix, whatever you would be appropriate. But don't just save it in one field called name. If that were the case, you really wouldn't be able to, it'd be hard to sort on last name, things like that. So don't take this too literal though. For instance, if you're going to store your customer's address, say they are at 700 North Main Street, you're not going to break that up into street number 700, street name Main, and then another field for street. Use a little common sense there, but in general, it says divide the data into the smallest pieces that you're going to need to access. Calculated fields. It says Access allows you to store calculated fields. We're not going to do that. At the table level, we're not going to do calculated fields. As you can see here, it does say there's There's a little bit of a benefit, but there's also potential problems. We're going to be using calculated fields when we get into queries, so you can ignore the calculated fields in a table for this class. If you do have a date, there's a special data type which I'll show you, and it's called date time. So all this is saying is if you truly do have a date or a specific time that you're going to be storing, make sure you call your data type date time. That's all this means. Okay, once you have your tables created and you're storing your data in there, the whole idea behind a relational database is you're avoiding data redundancy by storing data in separate tables. For instance, you're going to store customer information in a customer table, then the orders that those customers make in a table called orders. You don't want to store the customer and order data all in the same table, because you would end up with redundant data. For instance, you'd have to store the customer's information in each order. That wouldn't be good. So the whole essence behind relational databases is to have these separate tables, and then you join them with a common field. For instance, you'd have a customer table and an order table. You would just put the customer's ID in the order table. That would become the common field. Join them. This will become a little more evident. I'll demonstrate this in Access in a bit here. Creating tables, I went a little bit through this in the first chapter, but we're going to create our fields in Design View. You can also enter data directly into Datasheet View, but that's really more for novice users. Where the hands-on exercise, I believe, has you do this once, but we typically, as programmers, wouldn't do this. We would create our tables in Design View. Also, the hands-on exercises goes through some steps to import data from one database to another, or from an Excel spreadsheet in this case, into Access. That's a pretty common thing, so I suggest you go through those hands-on exercises to do that. That's actually slides 26 through 32 on this slide set. I'm just going to skip those because you're going to be able to see the steps on how that happens in Access when you go through the exercise in the chapter. When you're creating your field names, make sure your field names are meaningful. Well, that's pretty much common sense. If you're going to store somebody's birth date, you're not going to call the field XYZ. Just call it birth date or birthday or whatever. Call it something meaningful, just as you would a file when you create a file on any computer. Your field names can be up to 64 characters. Typically, they're not. They're a lot less. You can have numbers. You can have spaces, but I really strongly suggest you don't have spaces. Access allows that, but it just causes more trouble later on when you're trying to use those fields. Use camel case notation. That's always it's usually a fairly standard way. Here's a field called product cost. It's where the first letter of each word in the name is capitalized. That works the best in my opinion. You also need to specify a data type, because that's the type of data that can be entered. Access has 10 data types. Let's take a look at them here. Here they are. The ones you'll be using mostly are number, text, date, time, currency. Yes, no is a Boolean. There's only two values. It's either yes or no. Some databases call this true or false. Same thing. Then the auto number field, that's typically a lot of times used for the primary key. Primary keys don't have to be auto number, but you'll see that sometimes they are. We won't be using OLE, hyperlink, or attachment much, or memo. Foreign key. This is one of the critical concepts I say in this chapter. You really have to understand what a primary key is and what a foreign key is. So here's a definition. A field in one table that's also the primary key of another table. Let me go to Access now, and I'll show you exactly what that means. Okay, I have a database open, one that you'll be using in this chapter, hands-on exercises, but I'm going to go to Database Tools in this relationship window. There's nothing in the relationship window now. Here's the tables in my database. I have 3 of them. This is for a small bank. You'd have the branch offices. I just drag these over. The other way you can get tables out here in your relationship window is to click this Show Table button. And then click the table you want to add. I'll just add the other 2. And then close it. And you can see, I like to move these around so the lines aren't crossing each other. But this shows a good example of the foreign key. So here we have branch information. Branch ID is the primary key. You can see that by this little key designation. Remember, a primary key is the field that uniquely identifies each record in the table. We also have a table here called Accounts. The account ID is the primary key of the account table. However, when you think about it, a branch probably has many accounts set up at it. However, an account is set up in one branch. So that has a one-to-many relationship. That's the most common and typical relationship in a relational database, one-to-many. So a branch can have many accounts. Each account refers back to one branch. So in this case, the branch ID field in the accounts table is the foreign key. Okay, you can see that because according to the definition, foreign key is a field in a table that's also the primary key of the related table. So this shows that very nicely. Over here we have the customer table. Of course, they open accounts. A customer may have many accounts. That's what this symbol means here on the line. And an account is opened by one customer. So that's a one-to-many relationship. The foreign key, well, that's customer ID because it is the primary key in the related table. The accounts table has 2 foreign keys in it, customer ID and branch ID. The branch and the customers table have no foreign keys in it. Okay, so back to the PowerPoint slides. I talked a little bit about this already. Datasheet view, you can look at tables in Datasheet view. You can design and create your table in Design view. And don't worry about these 2 views of a table, Pivot Table and Pivot Chart. We will not be using those. Okay, so that is the end of this first section of the lecture for this chapter. I'll pick it up in the next video.